video and audio, including the screen names you've chosen. If you'd like to change your screen's name, please do that now. During the discussion, if you'd like us to pause the recording before you speak, you can message Johanna privately. We are using closed captioning, so you can switch that on to follow if there's audio difficulties or to keep up with fast talkers. To begin, if you could all briefly type in the chat, if you're comfortable doing so, where you are now, what your main research focus or work focus is, or what brings you here today, and then we will resume.
What do you want to repeat? I don't think anyone is. I don't see anything in the chat.
I was just mentioning if you would like to type in the chat just a brief introduction to who you are, where you are, what kind of main interests you have in today's session or in your research more broadly. Okay, thank you. We'll, of course, see you introducing yourself, but I will start introducing the speakers for today while you do that. Today we have Dr. Lusine Grigoryan, lecturer or assistant professor at University of York, primarily interested in intergroup relations and political action in authoritarian states, but also has interests in a variety of other social psychological topics. And we have Dr. Vladimir Ponizovskiy, assistant professor at Durham University, also interested in values and attitudes and social influence and computational social science. And we have Isabelle Weißflog, doctoral student at Ruhr Universität, Bochum, also interested in intergroup relations and social identity, queer studies, and gender roles, and other forms of social psychological research. Today, they'll be talking to us about their large-scale survey that they conducted in Russia in 2022, and we'll discuss the role of media, values, and emotions in anti- and pro-war attitudes and behavior. So the speakers will give each a 10 to 15-minute presentation, and then we'll take 10 to 15 minutes to discuss each presentation after each speaker talks. As each talk goes on, please write down any questions or comments for the authors that you might have on the what we call the Jamboard for collective note-taking. Johanna will put the link in the chat for that.
Maybe just to add, the Jamboard, not everyone has used it before, so there are little sticky notes you can put on there, and on slide 5 we have this session's board, and we have one side for just kind of observations and important points you want to capture, because we like to keep these slides as like a souvenir of the session that you can also download. And then on the other right side of the board is the side for comments and questions that you would like to later see discussed in the session.
Thank you. And a few ground rules for the discussion. Please, everybody, mute your microphone except when you're talking. If you want to speak, either use the raise hand function or type a question mark into the chat. We'll call up people, and if you had a turn, we'll first call on others. When you speak, please stick to 2 minutes maximum. We'll have to interrupt or set timers if it goes beyond that, so that as many people as possible have a chance to speak. And we will remove participants who harass or troll or make political statements not directly related to the work being discussed. Would any of the speakers like to add anything before we start, or can we begin the presentations? Okay. We'll figure out the Jamboard issue, but in the meantime, Dr. Grigoryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, and can you hear me all right? I guess yes, because you already answered the previous question. All right. Okay, hi everyone, and thank you so much for inviting us. I'm really glad to be here and to have this opportunity to discuss our work with you all. So we are going to present findings from a large online survey where we asked Russian citizens about their views of the ongoing war in Ukraine. And before I start, I should also say that this project absolutely wouldn't be possible without our colleague Evgeny Osin from the University Paris-Nanterre. He's not here today, but he was an essential part of the research group and still is. So thank you to him. And the structure of today's talks is going to be the following. So as Fuad said, 3 short talks with a lot of hopefully discussion time in between and at the end. I will start at the kind of intra-individual micro level and talk about the role of emotions in anti-war action. Then Vladimir will continue at the meso level, talking about perceived consequences of the war for basic human values. So essentially, these are social representations of the war in Russia. And finally, Isabelle will cover the more macro level and talk about the role of media and conspiracy beliefs in all of this. With that, let me begin with a brief description of the context. So on February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine on multiple fronts. From south, from the Crimean Peninsula that it has occupied and annexed back in 2014, from the east, from Donetsk and Luhansk territories that were also partly occupied since 2014, and from the north, from the territory of neighboring Belarus, trying to get straight to the capital, Kiev. And I cannot stress enough how shocking this invasion was, not only for people outside of the region, but also for people in the region. Both Ukrainians and Russians, almost no one believed this could happen until it actually happened. And of course, many Russians took to the streets as soon as the news broke. Protests were happening in most major cities. All these pictures are from the first 2 days, basically, after the invasion happened. The first one says, peace for Ukraine, freedom for Russia. And in this one, besides multiple no to war signs, there is also one in the background that says, I'm ashamed to be Russian. But of course, the crackdown was also hard. According to the civil rights NGO Oveda Info, more than 15,000 people were detained in the first week after the invasion. And then it was prohibited to call the war a war, and instead it had to be referred to as the special military operation. And the final nail in the coffin of the protest movement was the law that prohibited the so-called discreditation of the Russian armed forces, which basically included anything that could remotely be interpreted as criticism of the war. And after the introduction of this law, all the remaining independent news outlets either stopped working or left the country, and the protest movement pretty much died down or went underground. So in this context, the broad motivation for this project was driven by 2 questions. First, why do people protest in such an environment or not? Because on the one hand, how can you not protest when your country's government is killing thousands of innocent people on your behalf? But on the other hand, why on earth would you protest when you know all too well all the risks involved? And here the last picture on the slide is Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who was poisoned, most likely by the Russian government. and most likely multiple times. Last time he was poisoned, he almost died, was saved by the doctors in Berlin, decided to return to Russia to pretty much immediately be imprisoned. So this is the prospect that you are facing. And yeah, I think this is a fascinating question of why people do or do not protest in such an environment. And the second big question was whether what we know about protest and collective action from studies conducted in democratic contexts applies to such repressive contexts where the risks are much higher and the risk of success is much lower. So what we did is we conducted an online survey in August 2022. This is 6 months after the invasion. And we used the crowdsourcing platform Yandex.Toloka because this was pretty much the only way to do this fully anonymously. And considering we're asking about the war and even calling a war is illegal, it was important that we do this as anonymously as possible. And we aimed for 1,000 participants. And after all the data cleaning, we ended up with almost that, 973 valid cases that we used in most of our analysis. And we were able to get a balanced sample when it comes to gender and age. All of these people are citizens of Russia. Most of them live in Russia, and 90%, about 90% are ethnic Russians. And sorry, I lost here. I think I need. And we had also a good balance in terms of socioeconomic background, with about half of people reporting having lower than average income and about half reporting having higher education. And finally, we have also a nice distribution in terms of support and opposition to the war. Considering this is an online sample that is likely to be a bit more liberal than on average the population of the country, we have about 47% of people saying that they support the war, 28% oppose, and 25% say that they are not sure. And just a small note before I move to the rest of the methodology. Everywhere in the questionnaire, we use the term special military operation because this is officially what you are allowed to use in Russia at the moment. But in the presentation, I will switch back and forth between calling it a war and calling it special military operation, just for you to keep that in mind. So we included a bunch of measures, and we will talk about most of them today. The ones that we will talk about are in bold, and in all of our talks, we are going to use the attitudes towards the war and behavior as the dependent variables or the outcomes. In my talk, I will be talking about emotions that the war evokes and political beliefs that potentially underlie these emotions. Vladimir in his talk will focus on perceived consequences of the war for values, and will kind of juxtapose those with other well-established predictors such as national identity, right-wing authoritarianism, and social dominance orientation. And Isabelle will discuss the role of media, consumption, trust, and conspiracy beliefs. And if you're interested in the few that we do not cover here, also happy to talk about that more. Now, I will briefly introduce and describe how we measured attitude and behavior towards the war, because we are all using those measures. For attitude, we asked kind of Osgood style bipolar scales, whether the special military operation is bad or good, harmful or beneficial, useless or useful. And then we had 3 types of behavioral measures. For past behavior, because we didn't want to force participants to disclose too much information, we just gave them a list of 8 different behaviors that they could have done in the last half a year since the invasion started, like signing a petition, participating in a demonstration, etc. And we just asked them to give us a number for how many of these things they did in the past. And we had the same set of measure when it comes to behaviors for support of the war and opposition to the war. So we separately asked about both to cover kind of the whole spectrum of opinions. Then for future behavioral intentions, we use 3 items that are coming from theory of planned behavior type of studies, like I plan to take part in political action against the war or in support of the war. And finally, we also asked about action probability, like how likely do you think you will actually do those things that you just said you might want to do. So these are our behavior measures, and this was a general kind of introduction to the context of the study and its methodology. And now I'm going to turn to more specifically the role of emotions. So my personal interest in this project was why people did or did not experience group-based guilt and shame when the invasion happened, and whether experiencing these emotions was motivating anti-war action. And if you remember in my first slide, I showed you a protester who was holding a sign of "I am ashamed to be Russian." Now, this was definitely not a popular sentiment in Russia and still isn't. The backlash to a few people in kind of public spaces saying that they feel ashamed was so strong that "I am not ashamed" became a popular hashtag in 2022. And this beautiful T-shirt that you see here on the slide has the Z letter, which is basically Russia's 21st century swastika, representing support for the war. And the hashtag below says "I am not ashamed." And of course, this was popular with people who are supporting the war, but even people who were against the war mostly argued that they do not experience these emotions because they have no control of what their government does. The things that people were saying in social media were like, "It's not my fault that the government is crazy. I did not invade any country. I did not kill anyone. So why should I be feeling guilty or ashamed?" So essentially, the argument was that we don't have control over what our government does, so we shouldn't experience these emotions. But of course, we know from the literature that people are perfectly capable of experiencing emotions based on their group memberships, both positive ones like pride and negative ones like guilt and shame. And I don't really have time to go into theory here, so I will just show you the 3 research questions that we wanted to address, but happy to talk about theory as well if we have time later. So the 3 questions were those: whether feelings of group-based guilt and shame are conditional upon political beliefs that people can influence the actions of their governments, whether guilt and shame are predictive of anti-war action in an authoritarian state, and whether guilt and shame are actually better predictors of anti-war action than other emotions or attitude. And I will briefly also show you the measures specific to this part of the study, which include the political beliefs. And this is like we included just a wide range of different measures that would tap into the sense of having control or not having control over what your government does. And this includes support for democratic values, political alienation, so believe that nothing we do matters, political cynicism, just believing that politics is bad overall and you shouldn't engage with it. And this one split actually into 2 subscales of politicians are horrible people and politics as a process is bad and you should not engage with it. And finally, political responsibility, which is actually a scale we developed ourselves because we couldn't find anything like that. And an example item here would be, if I see that the country is going in the wrong direction, it is my duty to get my voice heard by the government. So these are our political beliefs. Then we had positive and negative affect schedule, short version of it, just 12 emotions. We asked, when thinking about the special military operation, how do you feel? And we did a factor analysis here, excluding guilt and shame because we had separate measures for that. And interestingly, we got actually 3 factors out of this measure: positive emotions like joy, hope, and enthusiasm, and negative emotions split into 2 subscales: negative dominant emotions like anger, and negative submissive emotions like fear, sadness, and depression. And finally, key measures here are group-based guilt and shame. These are measures adapted from Reyes and colleagues. I think they were initially developed for use in Germany in the context of the Holocaust. And you can see that guilt is straightforward, but shame is divided into 2 types of shame, which previous studies show that have different consequences. Image shame is I'm ashamed because other people will think badly of us, and moral shame is I'm ashamed because what we do is morally wrong. So you can see that there is an important distinction there. Results. So I'm just briefly showing you the descriptives because there's one important thing to note here. If you look at the diagonal, you can see the distribution of our group-based emotions and behavioral intention measures. And you can see that all these distributions are zero inflated. meaning that a lot of participants said that they did not do anything, they are not planning to do anything, and they are not experiencing either guilt or shame. And this was about 80% of participants giving 0 scores for behavioral measures and about 70% giving 0 scores for guilt and shame measures. Having this in mind, we analyzed all of the results both in linear models and in zero-inflated negative binomial models, which allow to differentiate kind of yes, no, zero, non-zero responses, and then the degree if it's not 0. So sometimes I will present you the linear model when it's not different from the zero-inflated model, and sometimes I will present the zero-inflated model. Now, the fun part, the 3 questions and what we found. So the first question was whether it is important to think that you have control over what your government does in order to experience guilt and shame. The short answer is no, it's not. You can see here we have the zero-inflated model. The first column in each case shows yes, no, basically no emotions at all or some level of emotion. And the second column shows the degree of emotion or the intensity of it. And you can see that democratic values are the only thing that predicts consistently experiences of guilt and shame. And democratic values are not about believing that you have control, but about believing that you should, or that people should, in general, be able to have a say in how the country is being run. So this is much more about ideals than about actual efficacy or sense of control. We also had positive links for politicians are bad, but I think this has much less to do with sense of control and much more to do with having overall a negative feeling about everything that's happening. Politicians are bad, everything is bad. I feel shame, guilt, and everything else. So none of the measures that tapped into that sense of control actually had anything to do with experiencing guilt or shame. Then our second question was whether experiencing these emotions is actually helpful for anti-war action. If you noticed from the descriptives before, all 3 emotions correlated positively with all behavioral measures, but once you include the 3 of them together in a regression model, controlling kind of for the effects of each other, then only moral shame has an effect on behavior. Neither guilt nor image shame impact behavior. And finally, we wonder how good of motivators guilt and shame really can be compared to other potential predictors like attitudes or other emotions. And here I'm going to just give you a very brief summary of the zero-inflated model, but to get it out of the way, in the linear model, moral shame is the most important predictor of future action. Here I'm just combining the behavioral intention and action probability as likelihood of future behavior. So moral shame was the most poor predictor, and negative dominant emotions were second most important predictor. But I thought it was really interesting that in the zero-inflated model, actually different things predicted action versus inaction and strength of intention to act. So when it came to the decision whether to act or not to act, it was attitude and moral shame that predicted this, all in expected directions. And when it came to the strength of intention, it was mostly other emotions. Negative dominant emotions predicted higher intensity of action in the future, and submissive emotions had a small negative effect. So this is mostly it from my side. I think to me that the key takeaway from this part is that morality is central and essential to resistance in oppressive contexts. I think the key question for me here is whether it's more central or more important in such contexts compared to democratic contexts, or it's just always very central. And another thing that I thought would be really interesting to discuss, at least I've been thinking about it quite a bit, is the role of identity in all of this, because on the one hand, you should see your repressive government/regime as part of the in-group or as representing the in-group in order to feel guilt and shame. On the other hand, you need to see them as the out-group if you are going to fight against them and try to do something about it. So I think this question of in-group boundaries is really essential to the sense of responsibility. And yeah, would be happy to talk about that, but also about anything else that people want to talk about. And that's all from my side. Thank you. Should I stop
Thank
sharing
you very
or
much.
keep the slides?
Might be helpful to keep them up for in case someone has a specific question. Thank you so much for that interesting presentation. I see there's just a few comments or questions for discussion on the Jamboard. Maybe we'll take an extra minute or two to formulate some questions, and then you can just pop them in the Jamboard and raise your hand.
It's also possible to just raise a hand without putting it on the Jamboard, right?
Yes, of course.
Okay, just to clarify. Thanks.
Vlad, I know you said to keep the slides up, but I think for discussion it might be more conducive to look at each other's faces. So I suggest putting the slide down.
Yeah, I'm gonna do that, and I can always share again if there is a specific thing you wanna look at.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Johanna?
Yeah, I have a general question. Sorry, I need to put down the hand. So I know you talked about the need for anonymity in the survey given the repressive context, but I'm still wondering to what extent, and you used the term that is legal as opposed to war, but I still wonder whether we can trust, like how much we can trust findings like this in these contexts, because even if it is anonymous, are people maybe still concerned that someone could see what they write, right? So that's kind of a more general methodological question about research in general in these contexts. And a second question I had was if you could say a bit more about your measure of collective action and if all of the items were about overt collective action, because the item that you listed was signing petitions, which I would think is a particularly risky thing to do, putting your name on a petition in a context like that. So I was wondering if your measure differentiated maybe some more subtle, covert, kind of more underground types of actions as well.
Yeah, thanks. Both excellent questions. For the anonymity issue, I'm absolutely sure that we had some people who did not want to disclose their actual views. And I think that is pretty much impossible to avoid this problem when you're doing studies in this kind of context. But I think everything we could do to make them as candid as possible, we tried to do. So I rather than doing, I don't know, telephone surveys or doing community sample or doing student samples when you know your lecturer who gave you the questionnaire will probably see what you wrote there. So there are like many other worse way of doing it that would make it less likely that we could trust this. But looking at the distribution of self-reported support for the war, I'm pretty hopeful that we more or less succeeded in kind of convincing most of, at least of the participants, that this is going to be anonymous and they are not going to be identified in any way. Yeah, I don't think there is a way to do it 100%. Yeah, like avoid that problem altogether. It's always going to be there, but overall, looking at the distributions, I think it was reasonably. These were reasonably genuine responses from most participants. And for the collective action questions, so for the past behavior, I was looking at the description of the measures in the paper, but I also have only a couple of examples there. We did have, I remember we had sabotage as one of the options. So we had a list of 8 behaviors that included, I think, both overt and covert behaviors. But I think it probably leaned more heavily on the overt side because it had demonstrations, it had signing open letters and things like that. But yeah, I think there were at least some examples of more discrete behaviors. And when it came to future behavior, the items are very generic, just like, do you intend to take part in political action? Whatever you can imagine under political action. We also gave some examples in the instructions similar to the previous ones we used in the past behavior measure. But overall, it was it was broad enough that I think people could imagine whatever they wanted to imagine under political action.
Thank you. We have a few new questions on the Jamboard. Would anybody like to read their own question, or I can read one out? Yeah, Sayed.
Hi, thank you. I was when you were telling us about the study, you shared in the beginning, you collected some demographic variables, and particularly whether people who already support the special operation versus not, or they were unsure. And I think you showed the ratio. And I'm wondering whether the pattern you showed, particularly, I'm curious about the democratic values variable, as in this abstract moral belief about society, and whether number one, how that differed between these three groups of people, and whether you can use that as a between subject variable in your model. So for example, are the morals of shame and guilt doing the exact same thing, or there's literature by Nyla Branscombe on collective guilt, where collective guilt, lack of collective guilt serves as a almost like a repressive motivation, as you mentioned as you were introducing your topic. And I'm wondering if you have explored or looked at that yet.
Thanks. That's a really interesting thought. And no, we did not. At least I didn't look at kind of group differences at all on this support or opposition to the war measure. And it would definitely be interesting to look at the differences in political beliefs between the two groups. I feel like I did some analysis, at least on the it will take too long now to find that, but I think I did some analysis on how all the political beliefs that I showed affected attitude and behavior. But yeah, I would need to look for that, so it might take a bit of time. Yeah, but I can definitely see this having being different between the groups, and also like if you look at the means in general, the means are pretty high for democratic values. I think it's like around 5 on a 7-point scale on average. So in theory, most people do agree that democracy is great. But then when you ask the other questions about actually engaging in politics, then you also have very high scores of political alienation and political cynicism. And they're like, no, it's dirty, it's terrible, you should not engage with it because it's only for bad people. So those two coexist harmoniously or not so much together. But again, yeah, very good question about group differences and worth exploring further. Thanks. I'm not sure if I answered all parts of your question. Please do let me know if I missed something, because I feel like there was something else that I maybe missed.
Oh, no, please, thank you so much. I would be interested in looking at how that looks, because I'm also thinking about, as a function of the group differences, the model you shared, the function of the emotions, because you mentioned motivation. So I think that might be one direction you could look into as a hypothesis you could test.
Yeah.
Varying role of emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So we have a methodological question asking if you could please share some more information about the online panel, and in which ways is it different from platforms like Prolific or MTurk?
It's in many ways similar. I think it was probably inspired by those like MTurk, and I think it also initially was mostly used for like computer science by computer science people for doing small tasks, and then turned into a place where you can also do surveys. Yeah, I think in many ways similar. The only, like, if we're thinking about how representative it is of country's population, I think the only kind of major difference is that it's probably a bit more liberal, a bit more urban, because you need internet access and all the obvious things that online samples are limited for and by would be true in this context as well. But at least when it comes to demographics, we did make sure that we sample we get a sample representative of the country's population by gender and age. And as I showed, we also happen to get a pretty good distribution in terms of socioeconomic background and views on the war. I'm hopeful that it's a reasonably good sample to be talking about what people in the country think.
Okay, whoever wrote that question, if you have any follow-up questions about that, please feel free. Otherwise, there's another question about what other key emotions you might have thought about looking into, like fear or even terror, in relation to resistance to the war in this context.
Yeah, so we had this PANAS measure, the positive and negative affect scales, which included fear and sadness and depression. Well, depressed, I feel depressed as an emotion. And then it included that the dominant negative ones were anger, disgust, and contempt, I think. And the positive ones were like joy, hope, and enthusiasm. And I showed already the results for when we use them as kind of indices for positive, negative, dominant, negative, submissive. Still, moral shame on its own, group-based moral shame, is a more important predictor than the second most important, which is negative dominant emotions. But we also did an additional analysis where we looked at anger specifically, because anger has been studied much more in this context. And we find the same way. Yes, it does have an effect, but again, the effect of moral shame is stronger than the effect of anger on behavior, which I think is fascinating. Like, anger is such a strong emotion. It should have such a strong motivational drive. But you add that morality appraisal to a feeling that is very depressing on its own. Shame is not a motivating feeling. Normally, shame should motivate you to hide under a blanket and never get out, of your house. But you add that moral appraisal, that what we are doing is morally wrong, and then it becomes the most important, at least in our data, the most important driver, even more important than anger. Yeah, Johanna.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I put it on the board as well, but there's a chapter in the book that we edited by Ayanian et al., and they reviewed all of the studies on collective action in repressive contexts, and one of their main conclusions is that moral outrage is perhaps the strongest predictor in these contexts, right? So not efficacy, not all the others. So I think that nicely aligns with your findings as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, and I need that book. And yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's why at the end I would put like morality. Morality seems to be such a central element in it all. And yeah, I'm also really happy that Erin's work is basically finding the same thing.
We do also have a question about whether you think there's a difference between morality and moral emotions, and what you think and how you think these concepts relate, and what their boundaries are.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, morality is very big, of course. I mean, it's a big word. It can be anything. It can be beliefs, it can be values, it can be actions, it can be things that are considered moral or not. It can be ideological stance. It can, it's a big thing. So I think moral emotions are one way of looking at morality, but there are definitely many other ways of looking at it. And moral emotions, obviously, on their own are also bigger than moral shame specifically. Johanna just mentioned moral outrage would be an important one. And both guilt and image shame would also be considered moral emotions. So yeah, I would say it's a nested structure. Morality is just like this huge thing, all encompassing. Then you have moral emotions as one kind of angle to it, and then specific emotions that we've been talking about as specific examples or instantiations of that bigger category.
Thank you so much. Any last questions before we move to the next talk? All right, thank you so much. Vladimir, the floor is yours.
Oh, hi everybody. I'm Vladimir, and give me a second. I'll also try to share my screen. Okay, I'll share my desktop, I think. And okay, does this work?
Perfect.
Excellent. Great. So I will be talking about the section of our study that deals with beliefs and with values. And of course, I'm just the presenter, and it's all a collective effort throughout. So when the war began in, when the current stage of the war began in 2022, the reaction to the invasion has been quite muted within Russia, especially given the colossal scale of what was going on. The invasion was the largest land war in Europe since the middle of the 20th century, since the Second World War. It led to dozens of thousands of deaths on the invading side and on the defending side within months of starting, and the extent of the war crimes was staggering. And given the scale of what was going on, many expected a stronger reaction of the Russian society to the events. And Lucy have overviewed the protests which happened in the first weeks, but basically dissipated as the legislature was brought up to speed with the events. But the cultural life, the holidays, the kind of day-to-day business in Russia remained unaffected for a lot of people. And for many people, myself included, there was an expectation that given the absolute scale of the events, that it would leave a stronger mark on the society. And different explanations were proposed. People talked about fear. People talked about efficacy, whether there is a point in resisting self-efficacy and collective efficacy. People also talked about beliefs about the war, and here being embedded in the context to kind of see how stylized or how abstract are people's considerations when you have a lot of knowledge of the context. So yes, fear. Yes, there is repressions. There is situations in which people risk a lot and knowingly risk a lot. But then there are also different kind of more nuanced ways of the government to incentivize and de-incentivize action. With efficacy, similarly, with beliefs, people from the outside would often say that that propaganda is having the effect, or that people might not have access to accurate information. And yes, but again, it's a nuanced thing. And the internet is accessible. Yes, there are restrictions, but everybody is managing to solve them to get access to Netflix. So if you want information, you can get it. And yes, there is propaganda, but there's also a long history of distrust of what the government is saying. So it is a complicated thing. And in my part of the study, I was interested in looking at to what extent does this governmental effort of shaping the perception of the war, of what the war actually is, how big it is, how small it is, what are its consequences in shaping the collective action or the lack of it. So the constructs from the list that Lucy presented that go into this part is this intention to act in support or against of the war, this kind of broad level beliefs like RWA and SDO, the national identity, and the value instantiating beliefs. So the first three rows, you most of you know what they are, and for the last one you do not, because this is a trick question. This is something I came up with myself. So value instantiating beliefs, it's very difficult to pronounce. Basically, these beliefs about consequences of actions or events for basic human values, which sounds complicated, but it really isn't. It's a belief that everybody's familiar with, and examples of those are things like COVID is dangerous, and small group talks are fun, and electric cars are good for the environment. And the structure of them is that there is a subject, so electric cars, for example, or small group talks, or COVID, and the subject is linked to some positive or negative consequences for values. So some people think that electric cars are good for the environment, have positive consequences for the value of nature, that they're prestigious, have positive consequences for the value of achievement or prestige, maybe are weird, unconventional, so have negative consequences for the value of conformity. As Lucy mentioned, it's something that is similar to social representations on one hand, to kind of belief component of the attitude and Eisen's kind of framework. But I feel that these kinds of beliefs are very important in how we relate to the war, especially from this moral point of view. The way we measured those beliefs in relation to the war of the Ukraine was in a very straightforward way with a questionnaire. So we asked about the event, the war in the Ukraine, and the consequences that the war would have for people. So, for example, for the value of security, we would ask on this kind of semantic differential scale whether the war would be an unsafe thing for the person or a safe thing for the person. And we would ask that for a number of values, using as a kind of guiding framework the theory of basic values by Shalom Schwartz, in which values are set up as this criteria for selecting and evaluating actions. And the theory basically provides a typology of different motivational content. Okay, so I'll first walk you through the descriptives and then show you the resulting models. So for those questions, they had an opportunity to answer, and the instruction was that if you feel that the value is not relevant to the question, then you mark the middle option. So for some values, the war was very relevant, for others less so, and there has been different distributions of the consequences. So in those graphs, basically this is just a histogram of the responses or scores that people got on this value instantiating beliefs questions. So 4 would refer to people saying that the value of security is not relevant to the war, that the war would have kind of neutral consequences for the value of security. And for this particular value, 86% of participants said that there are some consequences that the war would have for their security, and there was slightly more people who said that the consequences would be negative, and about as much, but a little bit less people who said that the war does not pose threat for their own security. Here, a picture from a different slide. I noticed a mistake, so I had to kind of plug in from a different analysis. I think for conformity, the situation was kind of similar. So with also 86% saying that it's relevant, and that a lot of with the largest part of people saying that the war would have war is something that people around me expect to be happening, and a little bit less people saying that this is something that runs against the expectations of others. For tradition, 75% found it relevant, and it was kind of an even split in opinions. For benevolence or kindness, again, people also felt people found the value slightly less relevant, and found that the effect would be mostly negative. Most people agreed, and that the consequences for the value of universalism, or kind of peace and equality, and the well-being of the weak and the vulnerable in the society, that the war does not have positive consequences for that value. Few consequences for self-direction. Some of them were just less relevant. So few consequences for self-direction. Some people said that for hedonism, the consequences would be negative. That the war is not something that is pleasant or provides opportunity for pleasure and for achievement and power. Again, most people found it to be less relevant than other values and felt that the consequences are largely negative. As mentioned in the previous presentation, when we so this is one of the predictors, or one of the sets of the beliefs that were used to try to predict attitudes and intentions to act in opposition or in support of the war. And you might remember from the previous presentation that all these distributions are very heavily zero inflated, that the attitudes are kind of more evenly distributed, while the intentions, most people did not do anything and did not intend to do anything. From the first set of analysis, the value instantiating beliefs had fewer and less differentiating power than they had in some other contexts that I've studied, such as the US politics, where people really see the same subject very differently. And here there was some effects, but I decided to go with clustering of the value instantiating beliefs together to see what kind of perceptions of consequences of the war go together. So I used some K-means. I find this joke very funny. I'll give a little bit of time to for people to read it. But basically, I looked for an optimal number of clusters that would summarize the distribution of those value instantiating beliefs, and that was not 3 clusters, but 2. That looked, if we go back to the descriptives, more or less like this. So for the hedonism, achievement, and power, which were also the value instantiating beliefs that had the least relevance to the war, there were basically no differences, and the differences kind of increased as we were going for the conservation part of the value spectrum for security and conformity and tradition. So basically what the clustering differentiated is people who believed that the values of security, conformity, and tradition, the war would have positive consequences. So that war is something that would protect our security. That's something that we expect from each other, and that aligns with the tradition and the ways that things are done in our country. And people who did not believe that. And in the rest of the values, with the consequences for, like, people generally understood that that war has negative consequences for a lot of things, and disagreed whether the security, conformity, and tradition would be benefiting from the war. Running a couple of regression models where we would predict and zero inflated models the intention to oppose and intention to support the war. The value instantiating believes this clustering have okay. So the RWA and the SDO, which are the very common predictors of things like those, have worked fine with RWA, interestingly being a stronger predictor than social dominance orientation, with the intention to support social dominance orientation did not predict the intention to act in support of the war. National identification also was significant in both models, and the VAB cluster contributed, and this is standardized coefficient. The VAB clusters contributed at the same kind of scale as other predictors, and explain some independent variance on top of those usual predictors. So what we're concluding from this is that okay, that something that we know, there was very little action, either pro or against, very little intended action. And the usual predictors, such as the national identity, and RWA predicted pro and anti-war action quite well. With social dominance orientation, that was not the case, at least in the case of pro-war action. And to the answer to the question that that I began with, does propaganda explain the action or lack thereof? The answer, at least that I'm getting out of this, is somewhat, but in a kind of a bit of also a sublime way, that while people have very little trust towards what the government is telling them, there is a meaningful difference between those who sort of buy into the idea that the war is necessary for security reasons, for protecting kind of the conformity of conservation kind of drive, and people who buy into less. So people see the negative consequences, but for some they are compensated by this thing that the propaganda is purposefully pushing, and for others not. So yeah, in terms of variance explained, the proposed variable was about as robust as usual predictors and explained some unique variance. And that is it from me here. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much. Okay, maybe we'll take a live question first before we dip into our posted comments and questions.
Sure.
Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask live? Just raise your hand. Yes, Michal.
Oh, Michal, you muted.
Hi, and thanks for two great and very inspiring talks. And I'm really impressed that you made it to really conduct research in Russia at this situation. And I was wondering, I wrote here about this problem that Johanna already raised, because I think it might also affect very much the correlational effects that Lusine presented, right? Because if you have this distribution with so much zero values, right? And this is obviously a reaction to a very repressive context, right? So you would have very, very high correlations due to the fact that people are afraid of expressing their opinions, particularly on Yandex, knowing that Yandex has been taken over. I mentioned this Zakon Jagowy, you probably remember in 2016, that there was this law that allowed to control everything on Yandex and on such websites. So basically the social services have access to all activities. So my idea was basically to use one of these measures from Vladimir's analysis, basically conformity, as a kind of covariate. Because if you put it in as covariate in all analysis, then you at least might slightly deal with this problem of what we would call probably in democratic societies social desirability. And I don't think that this is a good term actually in case of repressive context, maybe political fear factor or something like that. That probably we could think about how to methodologically deal with it when doing correlational analysis. And I think it's a very valuable thing, because in all other repressive contexts, you might have very similar problems. Thanks.
Thank you. It's an interesting idea. I mean, yeah, it is kind of straightforward to implement. I'll just share some impressions on how I see the data. I did not see at least evidence that would lead me to think that there was a lot of self-censorship going on. Actually, I've been surprised at how eager people were answering questions, how few people wrote emails about us being foreign agents, because with some controversial topics that just happens immediately, and the people did not, and the percentages of people expressing different opinions kind of basically triangulates with with a couple of studies with like 25% being against, 50% being undecided, kind of passively supporting, and about 25% being very much in support of what is happening. Triangulates with people who used much more sophisticated methods to get at what is going on. Yeah, and also from what is happening and from trying to engage in some sort of activism, it is there is also not that much things actually happening. So it's not, I mean, repression is happening at the level, or we assume to be happening at the level of responding to the questionnaire, being afraid that Yandex will get you. Repression also happens at deciding to engage or not engage in the protests. And I think it is not the situation that actually people are, thanks, distribution of results, but I think it would be interesting to look for conformity kind of motive in there and see whether it makes a difference, but my bet would be that it doesn't actually. We'll see. Thanks.
Thank you. Just for the sake of time, I'm thinking we can move right to the next talk and then combine the discussion for both at the end, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you so much. Isabelle?
Yes, 1 second. I'm also going to share my screen. All right, I hope you can see my slides fine. Great. So I'm going to focus a bit more on the area of media consumption and trust in media and conspiracy mentality, and how that relates to attitudes towards the invasion of Ukraine and behavioral intentions, as we've already talked about. And regarding the measures, I'm going to talk a bit about them in the beginning because Lucy didn't go into much detail about my measures in the beginning. So for news consumption, we asked participants, we presented them a list of different media channels like TV, Russian news agencies, YouTube. Actually, I have the full list and can just read it to you. So one was governmental or federal TV channels and governmental federal news agencies, then online sources operating in Russia, but also online sources operating from abroad. So that would be the news outlets that mostly had to stop working or go abroad after the increasing restrictions on journalistic freedom. YouTube, Russian social media portals like VKontakte, and foreign or international social media sites like Facebook was a different category, as well as messengers like Telegram news channels. And we presented people this list of different media channels and then asked them how often they use them to get their news information from the following media, to find out what kind of media people consulted for news, as well as how trustworthy they found the media. And then we did an exploratory factor analysis to find out if these news sources clustered in any way, what kind of news sources we might classify as pro-government versus oppositional sources. And that didn't work perfectly with all of them. For example, Russian social media was not super clear in one direction, probably because people shared all kinds of information or political statements on Russian social media. But in the end, we had kind of an okay index for both pro-government news consumption as well as news consumption on more international or potentially oppositional news outlets. And that is what I will be referring to in all further results. Exactly, that I already mentioned. And of course, we were now interested, how does news consumption relate to attitudes and behavioral intentions towards the war? because based on what Vladimir just presented about the kind of propaganda about specific values, potential positive consequences that people could believe the war would have, or negative consequences that maybe it doesn't have. Yeah, we were interested in if news consumption can maybe explain that. Of course, our design was only correlational. We don't have any longitudinal or experimental data, which also would have been quite difficult to ensure anonymity of the participants if we wanted to do anything longitudinal. So yeah, of course, we can't draw any causal conclusions from that, but we wanted to see if there's an association. And pretty much as predicted, news consumption from pro-government media predicted more support and less opposition against the war. So people who were watching more federal TV and getting their information from federal news outlets, for example, supported the war more and expressed less opposition. And that is all about the attitudes in that case. So when I say support and opposition, I mean attitudinal support and opposition, and intention to act would be the specific collective action intentions. Yeah. And people who got more news from pro-government media also reported more intention to act in support of and less intention to act against the war. So that's pretty much what one would expect, and also what our hypotheses were. So that was nice. And we found pretty much the opposite effects for oppositional media consumption. So yeah, on all of these variables, that people who consumed more oppositional or international media outlets would express less support and more opposition against the war, and had more intention to act against the war and less intention to act in support of it. And yeah, one of the potential factors in that could be VIBs, as presented by Vladimir earlier. So I also looked into how media use, like what kinds of media people got their news from, how that related to their VIBs about the war. And first I looked at, okay, how which VIBs correlate most with attitude, and then looked at it more closely to see if they also were associated with the media sources people consulted, like the VIBs that significantly correlated with the attitude. And indeed, media use predicted the VIBs regarding the war for tradition, hedonism, self-direction, benevolence, security, conformity, and power, which were all VIBs that correlated highly with attitudes towards the war. And that was also the case in the expected direction, in that pro-government media overall predicted more positive VIBs, so people would believe that the war would have more positive consequences for all of these values, and oppositional media consumption predicted less positive VIBs, so that people would believe that the war had less positive consequences for all of these values. And then also further looking at how attitudes are predicted by these VIBs, the support or opposition towards the war were also predicted by more positive VIBs, at least in the case of these VIBs, which also something that Vladimir already touched on. And as we also talked about before, attitudes also somewhat related to behavioral intentions. To support or oppose the war, again, this only emerged if we coded the outcome binary or did a zero inflated Poisson regression, because in general, the attitude, the intentions to act were very, very low. So yeah, that was different from our initial analysis plans, but then we had to make some adjustments based on the distribution of the variables, and that was also the case here. But after doing that, at least, we could say that behavioral intentions was at least somewhat predicted by attitude. So another aspect that I was interested in regarding narratives in the media was the specific role of trust in different media outlets, and how that would influence the effect of consumption of different media outlets on people's attitudes towards the war. And I looked into whether trust in general predicted attitudes towards the war, trust in different media outlets, and how it interacted with consumption. And overall found that trust in oppositional media overall predicted less support for the war, which makes a lot of sense. You can see the different coded lines. The yellow one is higher trust in oppositional media, and then green and blue ones are lower trust in oppositional media, mean and plus and minus 1 standard deviation each. So you can see that in general on the y-axis is support for war, that support for war is overall lower when trust in oppositional media is high. And there was a significant interaction that was especially the case when consumption of oppositional media was also high. Yeah, as you can see, it's not a giant difference, but it was significant. And also, similarly, we found that overall trust in oppositional media predicted overall more opposition to the war. And again, especially when consumption was high. So a positive interaction between consumption of oppositional media and trust in oppositional media. For the government media, we also found that overall trust in government media predicted more support for the war. And again, this interaction with consumption, so that when people consumed more government media and trust in these media was especially high, then the effect was even stronger. And also trust in government media overall predicted less opposition to the war, but in this case, there was no interaction. So it was just overall, when people trusted government media more, they would oppose the war less, but didn't vary based on the amount of government media they consumed. Yeah, so another measure I was interested in that's also somewhat related to trust, but not in specific media and more in powerful actors in society, is conspiracy mentality, which Lucy already briefly mentioned in the beginning. And I was wondering how that relates to trust in news sources. And conspiracy mentality, maybe to briefly say a bit about the concept, was, I think it was kind of defined by Imhoff and Bruder in 2014 as a generalized political attitude and kind of a general propensity to believe in conspiracy theories, as opposed to a lot of measures about conspiracy beliefs that specifically ask people about specific conspiracy theories. So a lot of existing measures have asked people to indicate their agreement with specific theories that exist, and this one tries to be more general and ask more about a way of thinking that lends itself to conspiracy theories without touching on the content of specific ones. And they found that it specifically predicts mistrust and prejudice against powerful groups. And an example item would be, most people do not recognize to what extent our life is determined by conspiracies that are concocted in secret. And why I think this is very interesting in Russia is because in Russia, the government and associated governmental news outlets engage in a kind of conspiracy rhetoric, for example, about the West that's coming to undermine traditional values, which does have some overlaps with, but also distinctions from what you could call more general popular conspiracy theories in Russia. And I think that's quite an interesting case when government actors are engaging in conspiracy narratives, while they are actually the actors that are powerful in society. And what that will, how in this context, people's conspiracy mentality will predict their attitudes and trust and other factors. So I thought that was quite an interesting context to look at conspiracy mentality. And opposed to our prediction, conspiracy mentality predicted lower trust in pro-government sources. Our initial reasoning was that maybe since there is this, there are these conspiracy narratives that are often present in government rhetoric and the associated rhetoric in the media, that maybe conspiracy mentality would resonate with that, and people would thus trust pro-government sources more. But actually, we found the opposite. And I think that's quite interesting, and maybe we can also discuss a bit about why that could be the case. I think there's potential explanations. I also exploratorily looked into if conspiracy mentality on its own predicts attitude towards the war, but it does not. So it seems more related to trust than to attitude in a specific direction. And you could say that maybe it indicates that participants with high conspiracy mentality do view the Russian government as powerful, because conspiracy mentality is associated with this general negative evaluation and distrust of powerful actors. And it kind of goes against the content of a lot of the conspiracy narratives that go more into a kind of victim framing that would depict, for example, the Russian government and the Russian people as victims of aggression from the West, for example. So I think it's quite interesting, the implications that might have for what people actually believe about the Russian government and how much they buy into certain narratives, etc. But yeah, we were only able to capture that in a very broad way, obviously, with this measure of conspiracy mentality. What's also interesting is that in this initial study I referenced, where they introduced the concept, Imhoff and Bruder showed that in some cases conspiracy mentality can motivate action towards social change. And their example was that after the Fukushima disaster, people with higher conspiracy mentality in Germany were more likely to support divestiture from nuclear power, because they were more likely to think that Fukushima was a sabotage act. And so they were more distrustful of nuclear power and advocated for getting away from it, basically. But I also explored that in our sample, and conspiracy mentality actually predicted lower intention to act against the war, but no other behavioral intentions. So this is not something that I could confirm here, but also I think it is a very different context, a very different topic, and I don't think it's super comparable to say that just because they found it in this setting, that would also make sense in the Russian sample. So yeah, that was a short overview of my findings from more of the media area and trust in media. And again, since I'm the last person presenting, I want to thank you very much for having us here, and also my wonderful colleagues, Lucy and Vladimir, and Yevgeny, who is not here today. And yeah, thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Isabelle. All right, so we'll take some live questions. Yes, Lucy.
If I may. Yeah, actually, we haven't discussed the conspiracy beliefs findings much yet, and I'm really curious what Isabelle thinks and also what others think. So what we found is actually in line with the literature, that the higher conspiracy mentality, the less trust in pro-governmental everything. That's what you would find in other contexts. But we decided to go with a risky prediction and say, because Russian government is so conspiratorial, and Russian media, pro-governmental media, is so conspiratorial by itself, we will find the opposite in this context, which we didn't. So we still found what usually people find in democratic contexts. And I'm wondering if there is any context, any country where the official power would be so conspiratorial that we would find this reversal of the effect. Like, do you think it's even possible that this effect reverses, or is this just such a strong association that as long as you technically are in the position of power, then people with higher conspiracy mentality are not going to trust you, even if you yourself engage in conspiratorial thinking to a high degree?
Well, I think it would be possible. That's why I kind of bet on this a bit unconventional prediction, right? That I think even if you're in a position of power, but if you can really convince people that you are not, and that other people are actually the ones that are in the position of power. I think if most people in our sample had really, really strongly bought into the belief that the Russian government doesn't really have power, and actually the West is much more powerful, and I mean, that was also a lot of the narrative behind invading Ukraine, right? Kind of this idea that we have to secure our stance, like from the position of the Russian government. And I think because kind of the West is threatening. And that's why I would have thought if people really, really strongly believed that, they might actually see the West as the powerful force that they have to mistrust. And I still think it could be possible to that people with high conspiracy mentality would trust their own government, but then mistrust other actors that they think are really powerful. I just don't think that was the case in our sample then, but I wouldn't rule it out entirely for a different context.
Thank you.
I think Johanna raised hand before me, so.
But it is not about conspiracy theory. So if you want to follow up, I want to bring it back to resistance.
Yes, of course. Conspiracy first. Yeah. Basically, I'm fascinated by this finding, really, because obviously, I mean, it is in line with thinking that conspiracy mentality is a very general phenomenon. It's not content contaminated. So it now, I mean, it works in the same direction as it should. On the other hand, it's probably the first finding that I have seen in my life showing the positive side of conspiracy mentality, right? I mean, showing that conspiracy mentality contributes to peace, basically, yes, because the reverse, so gullibility probably is responsible for, following authoritarian rule in their war efforts. And myself being a conspiracy theorist, when it comes to Kremlin, very much, and that's probably the only conspiracy mentality that I highly value and favor. I think it's interesting, and it shows that this psychological phenomenon should not be viewed as universally negative societal phenomenon, right? As a pathology, but rather as something which in certain context might have positive outcomes. So I think it's amazing, and I really would like to see that published and to refer to that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept. So thanks for that comment, because I also agree that kind of differentiating conspiracy mentality from specific conspiracy theories that often also include kind of, for example, anti-Semitic aspects or whatever specifically you're talking about, makes it more open to, okay, maybe in some contexts it actually has a small or a not so small grain of truth, and that it can actually be adaptive in a way in some contexts. And yeah, actually I'm not the expert on conspiracy theories or anything, so I'm definitely not aware of everything that's been published in the field. So maybe if anyone else knows if there has been any research on maybe more positive aspects of conspiracy mentality, that would be super interesting. And if not, maybe it's an avenue for interesting future studies.
Yes, say it.
Yeah, adding to this last conversation, I wanted to add that most of the conspiracy theories have been performed in, what is called the weird sample, and it's mostly conservatives. And I think from a motivational perspective, it is to fulfill epistemic needs. People have needs for closure, like, for example, 9/11 and different things like the COVID vaccination happening. This need for cognitive closure and epistemic closure. I think particularly in this scenario, I think the word conspiracy and a conspiracy theory have been conflated as far as these beliefs about like Illuminati and things being an inside job and so on and so forth, versus that the government is doing anything and everything. There's an oligarchy, and I think which is conspiring to retain control. I think that this could be a valuable contribution in that regard. That it's not. I slightly disagree that a theory or this psychological phenomena is different in context. I think the way psychologists are thinking about the phenomena is different. I think what they're trying to measure in this context is different from, let's say, people who are studying moon landing or the Pizzagate stuff are doing so.
In what way different, would you say?
Different in a way that it serves as a function for epistemic needs, because oftentimes a lot of the conspiracy theory literature focuses on very right-wing, particularly in the American context, right-wing beliefs about the elites planning and to invoke welcoming the Antichrist, for example, the QAnon belief system, the cosmology about George Bush and their administration doing the whole thing themselves, the moon landing being faked. I think those serve a different purpose. Whereas this sort of conspiracy thinking, you can imagine an authoritarian government doing each and everything to suppress speech, for example. And we could argue that, is it a conspiracy belief versus a conspiracy theory? And I think that's what makes it different than traditionally what has been studied as a conspiracy theory versus what I think as a rational response to authoritarian repression.
Yeah,
So
for
talking
sure.
about, and talking about a rational response as well, I think within the media stuff you've looked at, I was wondering to what extent is the role of this very tangible, very real material threat posed by NATO was something which you think is part and parcel of the messaging between local media versus international media, because there's a lot of people who do not take the position which many of the people in the Zoom meeting take, and they often find the response of the people as a rational response in the geopolitical sense, the threat posed by NATO, which I think it's a complete and it's an oversimplification, but I'm wondering whether that is also playing a certain role.
I'm not sure I 100% understood your question. Can you maybe rephrase it?
Oh, for sure. I was thinking about the media messaging, and I was thinking part of the media messaging, which is people making people trust local news versus foreign news. Is it about the local and foreign characteristic? I'm asking, like, is it because of like a social identity theory framework? Oh, this is Russian, so I'm gonna trust it. Oh no, this is Western, I hate it. Or is it about the type of messaging which they are delivering, which seems conducive with ideology versus not? For example, the Russian response being a rational response to continuous expansion of NATO and stuff like that.
Yeah, I suppose it could be, for example, about identity. And I mean, we also looked at national identity in general as a measure, but I haven't checked if it predicts trust in media, actually. And that could be interesting if that also plays a role. I wouldn't be super surprised if it did. So I think that's a good point.
It probably does. And I mean, in terms of the content of messaging, that is basically what we're finding, in that the exposure to Russian media is connected to those security VIBs, which is basically the war is, this is the reason. So in a way, what we're finding is consistent. And I just wanted to, I think I told it to Isabelle already, but that in your part of the findings, I really like that there is an interaction for the oppositional media and no interaction for the state media, which I think is also kind of revealing that people who say that they do not trust state media are still affected by consuming it.
Thank you so much. Johanna, you had one question about resistance rather than conspiracy. Maybe we can change gears a little bit and start wrapping up.
Yeah, we're also at time, so I don't want to keep people longer. I'm not sure.
At least I'm happy to stay and answer some remaining questions. I'm not gonna say that on behalf of others, but yeah, I'm happy to be around for another 10-15 minutes if there are any remaining questions to discuss.
Yeah, same.
Same.
Okay, you people are hardcore. I appreciate that. So just to bring back one question about resistance, which is the topic of our series, from the board. There was a really interesting question about the role of self-interest, and I think it relates to the questions about security and what security actually means in this context as a motivation for resistance. It also relates to the previous question, I think. So in the Schwartz values, right, there was in Vladimir's talk a focus on security beliefs. And obviously that's always a strong legitimization of war. But in this context, I also remember a lot of panic around the possibility of a general draft, and many Russian Jews that I know, for example, leaving the country at the time to avoid the draft. So in a sense, you know, there are two different meanings of the word security in this context, and I'm actually often puzzled how war is seen as, you know, securing security for the in-group as opposed to being a severe safety threat for the in-group, right? So resistance to war could be motivated by desire for security and self-interest, but in this completely different way. So I'm wondering if anything in your findings, if you had a sense from your findings on security, what people were actually thinking about, and also maybe the timeline, right? Like, was it around the time of the fears around the draft or before that? Because the specific context and timing could maybe also help explain to what extent opposition to war was actually driven by self-interest rather than being out-group focused, right? Which the findings on guilt and shame and morality might also suggest. Sorry, that's a long question.
Thank you for the excellent question. Yeah, we looked at them separately, at the kind of the societal security and personal security, which is something that there are separate questions for both. And from what I remember, at least the alphas were very, very solid, so they correlated quite a lot. So people who thought that the war is necessary for security were also the ones who thought that they were more protected from it, and people who were the ones who were least buying, which is also what we saw with the immigration away from people who were mostly anti-war people who were leaving. And I think we collected data. It was August, like it's been eventful 2 years, but it's been August 2022, and I think it was before the draft. I think the draft was announced in September or October. Yeah, thank you for the question. But I'm not sure who is supposed to pick up your question because you were.
No, I just wanted to make a mark. Petra, if you want to go ahead, since
No,
I'm moderating.
you go ahead and I will ask my question, I think.
Yeah, so I was just wanting to following up on that question. If there's a potential sort of understanding that the war and the mobilization for it and the threat of it domestically is unevenly, the risks of it are unevenly divided internally. So, you know, there has been some discussion of how, for example, ethnic minority and rural populations have been more heavily drafted and then more heavily affected by the war. Whereas your sample is probably more urban and liberal, and so perhaps that might be one reason why this kind of sense of personal security and societal security are positively correlated. since it's only like minorities that perhaps may feel otherwise. I don't know.
I think that's a solid thought. While at the same time, like yeah, there is an inconsistency there, and it's very visible. So, for example, Moscow and St. Petersburg have builded very much draft, and there is, if you look at percentages of population guessing, then yeah, the usual, the danger was also much stronger, or at least was visibly strong in those communities as well. It would be interesting to look at the the majority Russia, so to speak. No, exactly what we would find. These are fascinating contexts and sometimes heartbreaking to kind of. I've just been reading the kind of the notes of a person who is writing from a hospital and being harmed, while also kind of not forgetting to express all the support and the kind of the commitment to the governmental goals, and how there's somebody somewhere who didn't do their jobs, and this is why I'm in a situation which I am. Yeah, I don't know.
Just to get back to that, and a note for us, I guess, for the group, it would be really interesting to look at demographics and how they predict the different VIBs, because this is not something we've done so far. But like, we don't have many non-Russians, but we do have about 10% of the sample that are ethnically not Russian, and this include Tatars, but also Ukrainians, Armenians, and all other ethnicities that live in Russia. We do have a substantial group of people who are lower socioeconomic status, lower incomes, lower education, which who would obviously also be more affected by this. So at least when it comes to the VIBs, I think it would be really interesting to look at how these representations differ by the demographics, although we don't have like as diverse of a sample as would be ideal for this, but at least from what we have, I think it would be really nice to have that kind of differentiation in there. Thanks.
Thank you. Aritra.
Yeah, very interesting talk, especially in an ongoing hot conflict. I was wondering how timeline would play a factor. Like right now, what I see is the Russians, I mean, there is a talk of more funding, and there's a new war, that's Israel-Palestine war. And so I mean, people are right to believe in Russia that their position have been vindicated and all of that, because, well, the EU kept funding. There was a North Stream pipe bombing and as well. So there was a lot of thing going on against Russia. So how far did, in my view, how far did other factors contributing so far, that there was a lot of EU and US involvement, just not directly enough for Russia. I mean, for Russian government to say, well, look, these are the people we are dealing with, and there's nothing to protest against us, because initially it was an unjust violation, but now it's justified violation. If I mean, from denial to justification, could that be a factor in reduced, I mean, resistance efforts?
If you don't mind, I'll go first.
Yeah.
I think that is exactly the narrative of Russian media and Russian propaganda, like pretty much very clearly outlined. And yes, it has been essential to make people not want to engage. And I've been observing this up close, like within my own family. My dad watches TV, and whenever we talk, like that's the narrative that I'm getting, that yes, war is terrible, killing people is terrible, no one is enjoying this, no one wants this to be happening, but what else were we supposed to do? We were put in a position where nothing else could be done. We had to protect ourselves. But when you go into the facts of it, it's like, what exactly are you protecting yourself and it kind of starts to fall apart. But these conversations are very, very difficult to have because it's been at least 8 years, well, almost 10 years now. Because like the propaganda machine obviously started working even before the first invasion, the annexation of Crimea, and it has been working relentlessly for almost 10 years now. So this narrative has become so normalized and so embedded in the kind of common narrative of the country that yes, it's definitely something that is very helpful for the regime to not get much resistance and much opposition. I think if it wasn't for thanks.
Yeah, and maybe as
So
an
if I
add-on
were
to
to,
that,
yeah, sorry.
I would also say that it's unfortunate that we don't have longitudinal data on the media consumption, because I would very much expect that not only does media consumption influence people's attitudes, but also people want to confirm their own worldview and will keep going back to the kinds of media that support their attitudes. And I think that's also kind of a cycle that people, like Lucy's example, will go back to the same media and get their opinions supported and obviously stick even closer to their opinion over time. And we can't show that in this specific study now, that, but I would assume that's probably also what's going on. It has been going on for quite a while.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I wanted to use an opportunity to respond to one on the board that was about the VIBs, and it was about why do VIBs explain so little variance, and like one of the things in the line, because conceptually the social representation should be the defining feature of how you interact with some piece of social reality. And I just wanted to say that it's methodologically kind of an interesting question, because what I'm doing is I'm centering them. So I'm if I use them as is, the responses, then they are very, very closely aligned to the attitude, and then similarity of them to the attitude is basically making it difficult to examine what I'm interested in, which is the content of this representation, which is like, what are the most positive and most negative consequences for the thing? What does the thing kind of mean? What are the opportunities for values and costs for values that are there? So when analyzing, I'm basically trying to separate or methodologically separate the content of the content part and the positivity negativity part. And that way we can look at what the representation is about. And apparently it is, yeah, in this particular context. In some other contexts, it's very important. So in the Republican Democrat thing in the US, they basically see the same things very differently. And from those shapes of distribution hierarchies, you can tell quite a lot about behavior. In this particular case, what struck me also is that there's a very strong narrative that we see things differently, and that people who support the war are crazy and they have ununderstandable views of the situation. But from what we've seen, not so much. Like content-wise, the differences within those, like, yeah, did the NATO threat basically, was the NATO threat real? Do we really have to protect the country? Is this something that aligns with the tradition of who we are historically? The tradition component was very strong in the propaganda. Yeah, but like that, there is a specific difference. Other than that, people basically agree what this is about. A lot of pain, suffering, no better prospects for individuals. Yeah. Thank you to whoever asked the questions.
Any other questions for the speakers? All
I think we
right.
should let people go. And those of you who are hardcore enough to stay until the end get rewarded with some links here to our schedule for the upcoming talks in the series. And also, if you would like to present in this series, there's a form that you can fill out to propose your own session. So we're still collecting new proposals for talks sessions, various formats of sessions starting mid-March. And
Thanks so much for having us.
yes, I didn't mean to say this before thanking you all. I kind of jumped in. So I think Fuad was going to officially thank the speakers and close out.
Yes. So are we putting in the links? Okay. I thank you so much, everybody, for these really interesting talks. Really appreciate you sharing them with us. We've had a bit of interesting discussion, and there's quite a few questions we weren't able to get to on the Jamboard, but we'll share that with you. And hopefully you found that also useful to discuss your work with us. And we hope to see you in our series again at some point.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good
Thank
time
you.
of day.
Have a good night.
Thanks a lot. Great
Bye.
questions
Have a
too.
good Christmas. I think
Happy
this is the last talk
holidays.
before the, yeah.
Christmas. Okay.
Hanukkah, Christmas, whatever. Or New Year.
Whatever you're celebrating.
Yeah.
Right. Bye-bye.